Judith Jarvis Thomson's A Defense of Abortion. As you know, I assigned to you Graham Audie and David Boonin's introduction to this essay. And the way they set up the basic pro-life argument is as so: a human fetus has the same right to life as an adult human being. As we saw, this is the premise that Marquis emphasizes, okay? Now, Marquis doesn't really need to commit to this premise. All this premise is doing is really saying that a fetus or embryo or whatever we're talking about has a strong right to life. It doesn't need to be as strong as the right to life of an adult human being. Marquis himself doesn't seem committed to that. It doesn't need to be as strong as an adult human being's right to life in order to have a strong right to life. And a strong enough right to life maybe to defend it from abortion in many cases. But anyway, this is the premise that Marquis is focusing on, or the role that Marquis is focusing on, the premise that concerns the value of a fetus. And much of the debate on the street about abortion, and certainly before Thomson's essay, almost all the debate in abortion revolved around the idea, the debate over how morally valuable or important a fetus is. And what Thomson's essay does is help blow open the question of, well, even if a human fetus has a very strong right to life, even the same right to life as you or I do, does that really entail that abortion is morally impermissible? Okay, so that's what she's looking at. She published it in 1971. And as I said, she revolutionized the abortion debate by focusing exclusively on this premise. She has opinions about this premise, but she's focusing on this premise. It is probably the most widely assigned essay in philosophy. As far as structure goes, Thomson doesn't seem to believe that fetuses in early development have the same rights as human adults or have the same moral value as human adults do. She appears to be what is sometimes called a gradualist. And a gradualist feels that, well, at the moment of conception, maybe a fertilized egg has more value than an unfertilized egg and the sperm that met it. But it doesn't have anywhere near the moral value of a baby or a 10-year-old child. And the gradualist thinks that as gestation continues, as the embryo develops, it becomes something that has more and more value, gains more and more rights, such that, say, a woman who's 9 months pregnant is pregnant with a fetus that has the same sort of rights as a baby. Okay, the fact that it's just inside of her belly doesn't change, and by that stage of development, it is, for all intents and purposes, just like a baby the day after a baby is born. Although Thomson seems to be a gradualist in her views about the value of a fetus, she grants, for the sake of argument, that zygotes and embryos and fetuses and so forth have the same right to life as you or I do. So she just concedes that ground. She wants to focus on premise 2. She does not want to focus on premise 1. So she just grants premise 1. She begins, as you know, with the violinist case, all right, which is one of the most famous thought experiments in contemporary philosophy. And you recall that we have a famous violinist who has been attached to you against your will by the Society of Music Lovers. And they ask you to remain connected to him for the rest of your life. There will be different versions of this case. You should think about the case where you must be connected to the violinist for the rest of your life, the case where you need to be connected to the violinist for 9 months until they get kidneys for the violinist, and the situation where you need to be only connected to the violinist for 1 hour. But she begins with the most extreme case of you're needing to be connected to the violinist for the rest of your life. However, you have the option of detaching yourself from the violinist if you want to. They ask you not to. And she asks, do you have a right to detach from the violinist? So it seems to most people that you do have the right to detach yourself from the violinist. And this is a very important result, because what it shows, at least what it shows to those who have the intuition that you may detach from the violinist, is that even if somebody has a right to life, and no one doubts that the violinist has a right to life, somebody's mere right to life does not entail a right against someone else to keep them alive. Thus, although the violinist has a right to life, there's nothing in the scenario that suggests that the violinist has a right against you to keep him alive. And if that's correct, then even if the fetus has a right to life as profound as a famous violinist's, the fetus does not thereby have a right against the woman to keep it alive. Now, I will stop here and say there may be some other interesting facts about the woman that result in her having an obligation to carry the fetus to term. Okay, and Thomson is absolutely interested in talking about those. Okay, don't think that the violinist case shows that abortion is morally permissible all by itself. What the violinist case does is establish that the mere inference that having a right to life entails a right to be kept alive is a bad inference. That's really what it's doing. Okay. Now here the pro-lifer may object that the violinist case is analogous to cases of rape, that it doesn't shed light on cases where a woman consents to sex and gets pregnant from that. Okay. And indeed that is far more typical than cases of pregnancy from rape, of course. Now, Thomson may rebut that if abortion is wrong because the rights of the fetus outweigh the freedom rights of the mother to abort, then it shouldn't matter whether the fetus is the product of rape or not, because the fetus who is the product of rape doesn't have weaker rights. And Thomson must be right about that. Okay, so it isn't the case that the fetus has a stronger or weaker right to life if the fetus is the result of rape or consensual sex. The fetus has the same right to life. Now, if this seems wrong to you, be patient, because the next sentence is this: that the mere right to life does not entail a right to be kept alive. There are other things that are relevant, and rape may be one of those things. Okay. The point is that you have to decouple, I should say, the right of life from the right to be kept alive. That is all Thomson is trying to say at this point. All she is trying to say is that the mere right to life that a fetus enjoys, if indeed it enjoys such a right, she's just assuming that, but that the mere right to life that a fetus has does not entail a right to be kept alive. Now, many of you guys already believe this with respect to utter strangers. So you know that you can save lives with. So you may know that there are lots of poor people in the world. There are lots of starving people in the world. There are a lot of people in the world who can be cured by a very cheap treatment. Treatments and food that you can pay for without even missing it, without even missing the money. Now, those people have a right to life. But do they have a right against you to pay for it? Does somebody on the other side of the world have it coming, as it were, from you to keep them alive? If so, you better start paying up. But if you think that, well, you know, of course they have a right to life, I shouldn't go around killing them and stuff like that, but it isn't the case that I have an obligation to keep them alive, then you're getting Thomson's point. All right. Now, I know that it may seem really different in the case of a fetus and a mother. Fine. We will talk about that. We have to talk about that. But all Thomson is saying here is that the mere right to life of a fetus does not entail a right to be kept alive by anybody. All right? The mere right of anybody to life does not entail all by itself a right to be kept alive by anybody. There must be something else going on that requires you to take care of me, or me to take care of you, or anyone to take care of anyone. Now, if the violinist case seems most analogous to cases of rape, then we could also think about next cases of dangerous pregnancies. What do we do when a pregnancy is seriously endangering a woman's life? Can we abort in those cases? And some have said no. Some have said it's wrong to abort babies, even when the mother's life is in danger or in certain peril, even when you know that the mother and the fetus will die. Why? Because abortion involves the intentional killing of somebody, whereas if you don't have an abortion in those cases, you are merely letting die somebody, and killing is worse than letting somebody die, and so therefore abortion is wrong even in cases of dangerous pregnancy. That has been argued. It's also been argued that you're intentionally taking life in cases of abortion as opposed to merely foreseeing the death of somebody in cases where you just let the fetus kill the woman and maybe die itself. Okay. Thomson doesn't think much of this, but she's going to do more than just stamp her feet and moralize. She's going to explain what she thinks such analyses miss. And that is that the woman has a right to her body and to protect her body from threats, even innocent threats. So she offers us the next famous thought experiment of the small house and the incredible growing baby. All right. So imagine a woman is trapped in a small house that she cannot escape. That's like her body. Okay. You can't escape your body. And suppose she shares this house with a baby that just keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. So it just becomes, 3 feet big, 6 feet, right? It just starts growing and starts pushing her up against the walls of her own house that she cannot flee. But the baby maybe could flee it, maybe not, doesn't matter. Suppose the baby could flee it. Suppose that the house would just, break apart around the baby and the baby would waddle away. Thomson asks, as the woman is being pressed against the walls of her own house, may she kill the baby to stop it from growing so she could live? And she thinks your intuition is going to be yes, that she can protect herself from this threat, given that it is her house. And many of you have this intuition with regard to your right to defend yourself in your own house. Okay. And so what these previous analyses that say, oh, you can't kill, you can let die, you can't intend death, but you can foresee it, etc. What they are not acknowledging is the woman's property right, as it were, almost over her own body. Right? And so she has a special right to her body and to defend her life, even from not just an evil threat, like somebody breaking into her house. She has a right to defend herself even from innocent threats. And there's no doubt that the baby here, the incredible growing baby, is an innocent threat. So for Thomson, having a right to life does not entail, that's to say, it is not sufficient for having a right to be given any sort of life-sustaining help. Let's look at her next interesting case, the Henry Fonda case. Henry Fonda was a famous actor of that time, a very handsome man, okay? And I guess maybe Thomson had a crush on him. And so she imagines that she's so lovesick for him that she's going to die. She's literally going to die if he doesn't put his cooling hand on her feverish brow. And she imagines that to save her life, he'd have to fly from Hollywood all the way over to where she was at in Massachusetts to do this. And she asks, okay, I have a right to life, and I'm, lovesick unto death for Henry Fonda. All he has to do is put his hand on my forehead to save my life. Do I have a right against Henry Fonda to get in a plane and fly all the way across the United States and come to me and save my life? No. She says no. She has no right against him to do that. In fact, she says, she doesn't even have a right against Henry Fonda to walk across the room to save her life. If all it took was walking across the room to save her life, he doesn't have an obligation based upon any sort of right to life of hers to do that. Now, that doesn't mean, as we're going to see in a second, that doesn't mean that he doesn't have the obligation to walk across the room. Thomson does think that he does have a moral obligation in the walk across the room variant, but not because of any right to life that Thomson has, and not because she has a right against him to do so, okay, that he, as it were, owes it to her to save her life. And here's a point where if you're agreeing with Thomson about this, you have to think hard about the way you use rights speak elsewhere. So if you think that poor people have a right to health care, a right from, say, the rich to provide their health care, how is that any different than thinking that Henry Fonda has that you have a right against Henry Fonda to fly across the country to save your life? Okay, so what Thomson is doing here is advancing a very libertarian view about rights and obligations, that it's fine if you accept it, but just realize that if you accept it, you need to accept it consistently, and this may have ramifications on your politics that you would not anticipate in other realms, especially with regard to redistribution. Now, again, you might think redistribution is good and even morally obligatory, but not for reasons of a right of the poor against the rich. Okay, maybe, but that's a different view than how things are being discussed in those debates now. Okay, so we've talked about cases of rape to some degree. We've talked about cases of dangerous pregnancies. Both of these are fairly rare. What about cases or rare in places with good healthcare? What about cases that are way more typical, like pregnancy from consensual sex? Is it immoral to have an abortion in cases of consensual sex? Does the fetus maybe have a right against the woman in cases where the fetus is conceived from consensual sex? So here would be an objection along those lines. Go back to the violinist case, the objector may say. That case is analogous to rape, but having consensual sex is tantamount to inviting the zygote, embryo, or fetus into your body. And when you invite somebody into your body, this does give them a right against you to keep them alive, at least in normal pregnancy conditions where it's not, say, dangerous. So is consensual sex like an invitation? Thomson does not think so. She explains why she thinks no by way of the burglar case. So imagine that you live on a ground floor apartment and it's hot, it's stuffy, and you decide to open a window to get some air. Now, this is analogous to your being horny and you're deciding to have some sex, okay? Now, in the burglar case, you open the window, go to bed, and a burglar sneaks in overnight. And you wake up in the morning and you see there's a burglar in your kitchen or whatever. May you kick the burglar out? Does that burglar have some right against you? Does that burglar have some right to be in your apartment because you did something like open a window that increased the probability of a burglar entering? After all, you knew that burglars burgle, a famous line. You knew that burglars burgle. So you increase the chances of having a burglar come into your house. Doesn't this mean that you have some obligation to keep the burglar in your apartment? Well, of course not. Okay. The mere fact that you did something, the probability of a burglar burgling you, doesn't mean that you consented to being burgled. Okay. So the fact that you do something that increases the chances of X doesn't mean that you have consented to X, or that you have some sort of obligation to live with the consequences of X. You know that if you smoke, you're increasing the chances that you'll get cancer. And you might be very frustrated by the fact that you're a smoker because of this. You may be very frustrated that some of your loved ones smoke because of this. But you get that although they're doing something that increases the chances of their getting cancer, something stupid, by the way, something irresponsibly stupid. But just because they're doing something that increases the chances, even irresponsibly stupid things that increase the chances of their getting cancer, you don't think that if they get cancer, they may not try to get rid of the cancer with chemotherapy or surgery. You think, okay, well, they still have a right to try to avoid the negative consequences of smoking. Likewise, you may think that sex when you don't want a baby is irresponsible, that it's stupid. But that by itself does not entail that you have to suffer the negative consequences of that stupid, irresponsible, increasing, irresponsible activity that increase the chances of something happening that you don't want. Now, some cases, Thomson's going to say, of increasing the chances of sex, you're not going to think are irresponsible. So, for instance, if you have sex and use contraception, that's like opening your windows with iron bars, right? So you're very interested in not having burglars in. Burglars show up in your apartment. So you put iron bars on your window and open your window. But a burglar comes in anyway. And you did do something that increased the chances of a burglar coming in. Even if you use contraception, if you have sex, you are increasing the chances that you get pregnant over if you were celibate. But most of us would say you weren't being irresponsible. What about if you just leave your house without a moderate-sized army, as she puts it? By doing that, you increase the chances of your getting pregnant. Why? Because rapists are outside. But no one would say, well, you did do something by leaving your house, or not wearing a huge chastity belt, or not always walking around in the presence of strong men. That, you're not doing that increased the chances of your getting pregnant, so thereby you incur some sort of obligation to carry the resulting fetus to term. No one would say that. So the mere fact that you're doing something that increased, hell, she says, not getting a hysterectomy, if, say, you're not interested in having children in the future, increases the chances that you're going to get pregnant, again, from sex or rape. But no one is going to say that the mere fact that you're not getting a hysterectomy incurs upon you some obligation towards a resulting fetus because you did something that increases the chances of your getting pregnant. Okay, so there's a big disconnect from doing something that increases the chances of X happening from your having some obligation to bear with the consequences of X, the negative consequences of X, or the unwanted consequences of X, in Thomson's view. Now, there's some places to push back against Thomson here with the burglar case. Imagine that you open your window and a little 10-year-old orphan girl squiggles through the window and sleeps on your kitchen floor, and you wake up. And suppose that a 9-month, the worst snowstorm in history, some 9-month snowstorm hits, and it'll kill anyone that goes outside. And the TV says, just stay inside, you'll die instantly if you leave. It'll be over in 9 months, though. Do you have some obligation not to kick the little girl out into the storm? Maybe. You have to consult your intuitions there. But still the question remains, is the moral obligation that you have one based upon the girl's right to life? Does that girl have do you owe it to the girl to do that? And do you owe it because of some right that girl has against you to do it? Or is there some other reason why you shouldn't do it? Now that case is a little weirder because the little girl had an independent life outside of your apartment. What if she didn't have an independent life outside of your apartment? What if there's something metaphysically weird about opening windows that sometimes pops little babies out on your kitchen floor, or little 9-year-old girls out on your kitchen floor? If so, does that change anything? Does the 9-year-old girl that popped into existence on your kitchen floor by your opening the window have some right against you to keep her in your house during the snowstorm? And that's to some degree what she's getting at with another one of her thought experiments, the people seeds thought experiment. So in this case, there are people seeds that float around like pollen. And if you open your window, one will come in and attach to your upholstery and start growing. The upholstery is analogous to the uterine lining. And you're trying to be conscientious, so you use fine mesh screens to keep out a people seed. But one gets in, okay, and attaches to your upholstery. And do you incur any sort of obligation for the care of this people seed, this people person that's growing on your upholstery? For after all, you kept your upholstered furniture. You did not get a hysterectomy. You opened the windows. You had sex. So if you're responsible to keep a pregnancy for merely acting in ways that make it possible for you to become pregnant, then by this reasoning, if you don't want to have a baby, you should get a hysterectomy or have an army of reliable bodyguards. So Thomson's point seems to be this argument. We could cast Thomson's point here in terms of this argument. We can summarize the burglar and people seed thought experiment lessons with this argument. Assume for reductio, that is to say, assume something we're going to try to show to lead to a ridiculous conclusion, that you invite a fetus into your womb when you do things that increase the chances of your getting pregnant. So if you do something to increase the chances of your getting pregnant, then you are, quote unquote, inviting a fetus into your womb. Let's suppose that's true. Well, engaging in consensual sex does increase your chances of getting pregnant. It increases your chances of getting pregnant even if you're using contraception, okay? And if that's the case, then you are doing if premise one is also true, then you are, quote unquote, inviting a fetus into your womb. But wait a minute. Failing to get a hysterectomy or going out to a party or going out to the grocery store increases the chances of your getting pregnant, right? So, and if premise one is true, then by doing those things, you are, quote unquote, inviting a fetus into your womb. So if you get pregnant from a rape because you didn't get a hysterectomy or you went out to the grocery store, you have invited a fetus into your womb because you have increased the chances of your getting pregnant. And by supplementary premises, if you invite somebody, as it were, into your womb, then you have an obligation to care for them. All right, so therefore you can't get an abortion. But premise 4 says, it's crazy to think that you invited a fetus into your womb merely by going to a party or choosing not to get a hysterectomy, right? There's no invitation here whatsoever to a fetus. So the assumption is false. Doing something that increases the chances of X is not sufficient for inviting X. So the assumption is false. Doing something that increases the chances of X happening is not sufficient for, as it were, inviting X to happen or incurring any sort of obligation to care for X or not to avoid the consequences of X. In section 5, things get a lot more complicated, but a lot richer. Thomson starts considering this question about decency. Imagine that pregnancies only lasted 1 hour. Imagine that the violinist needed you to be attached for only 1 hour. Imagine that Henry Fonda just needed to walk across the room to save your life. Now, for all these cases, Thomson says that the party, whether it's you, in the case of the violinist, whether it's Henry Fonda, in the case of the one-room variant, ought morally to save the life of the other person. So she thinks that Henry Fonda does have an obligation to walk across the room and save her life, if that's all it takes. And she does think that if you're connected to the violinist and it only takes 1 hour, if the kidney's on his way, even though the Society of Music Lovers did you dirty, you ought to stay connected to the violinist for the hour. You ought to stick it out for the hour to save his life. And she thinks that if pregnancy is 1 hour long, that you should not have an abortion. But does this contradict everything that she already has said? No, but in none of these cases does the party in need of help have a right against stronger party to help them, okay? Rather, the stronger party has an obligation based upon minimal decency, what she calls minimal decency. And how does she get there? Well, she considers the case of the Good Samaritan. And so you know the case of the Good Samaritan, but I will play you a little summary anyway.
A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Everybody listening was Jewish, and they could probably all picture the exact road Jesus was talking about. He continued, "A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side." You might expect a priest who was supposed to serve God to help, but he didn't stop. Then Jesus said, "A Levite came to the place and saw him, but he passed by on the other side too." Levites were assistants to priests, so maybe you'd expect them to help too, but he didn't stop either. Finally, Jesus said, a Samaritan came along. Remember, a Samaritan is a person from Samaria. That's near Israel, where God's family, the Jews, lived. But here's the thing. Jews and Samaritans didn't get along. In fact, nobody hearing this story would ever expect a Samaritan to help, because Samaritans and Jews couldn't stand each other. But Jesus said, when the Samaritan saw the man, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out money and gave it to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said, "and when I return, I will pay you back for any extra expense you have." Then Jesus asked, "Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?"
Okay, so that's a kid's story version of the Good Samaritan. Maybe you are familiar with it. I find most students nowadays are not. But Thomson's audience in the 70s would have been familiar with the story. Now, so Thomson thinks that we are not morally required to be splendid Samaritans. We're not even required to be good Samaritans. Maybe Christianity says so, but Christianity sets a rather high standard when it comes to rendering aid. She does think, though, that we do have an obligation to be what she calls minimally decent Samaritans. We have some obligation to aid those who need help. And that isn't because they have some right against us to help them. They are not owed help, as it were, from us. Rather, we just have a general moral obligation to render aid when the rendering aid doesn't cost us too much, and if we didn't cause the harm that the other person needs aid from. We don't have Good Samaritan laws in the United States. You're not legally required to be a Good Samaritan in most cases. Even states that have Good Samaritan laws, the obligation to aid is pretty minimal. So it's something like if you see somebody in a car, if you see a bad car accident, you're obligated to call in and report it. Or if you see a car on fire and somebody's trapped inside, you have an obligation to call the police and get some help to them. You're not obligated to run into a burning building to save somebody's life, but you are obligated to report the burning building. You're not obligated to pull somebody from a burning car, but you are obligated to report the burning car. So the so-called Good Samaritan obligations in America are quite minimal. Except, Thomson says, except in cases of unwanted pregnancies. And here she says there's this huge disconnect. We expect women to be splendid Samaritans and save the lives of others, in this case, fetuses, even at great cost to themselves, great physical discomfort, great social harm, financial harm, etc., if we don't allow them to have an abortion. And she thinks that would, there's no real explanation other than, just some sort of general sexist or whatever, some sort of irrationality around pregnancy or something like that to explain why we legally require splendid Samaritanhood around pregnancy, but not in other domains, not when it comes to burning buildings or burning cars or stuff like that. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. Certainly, You may think the draft of men for war is a case of the government requiring huge sacrifice for others. So, I don't really know whether she's right about that being whether or not anti-abortion laws prohibiting abortion are uniquely burdensome. So, in application, Thomson thinks that, look, if all Henry Fonda has to do is walk across the room to save my life, then he should walk across the room to save my life. He, in fact, is morally obligated by minimal decency to walk across the room to save my life. I don't have a right against him to walk across the room to save my life. He doesn't owe it to me to walk across the room to save my life. Rather, it's just an obligation, a general obligation to aid, that it's not so costly for him to save my life that he just walk across the room and save my life. Likewise, if you find yourself attached to the violinist, even though you were kidnapped by the Society of Music Lovers, even though they did you dirty, if that kidney is coming and it's on its way, it's only going to be an hour and you could detach, then she thinks you have an obligation of minimal decency to stay attached to the violinist, right? And she says, like, she seems to say that if pregnancy were just 1 hour long, that you would have an obligation to stay pregnant. I suppose even in the case of rape, given what the thought about the violinist. So if you were pregnant, even from rape, but pregnancy was 1 hour long, she seems to think that you shouldn't get an abortion, that you have an obligation of minimal decency to do so. Now, if you're going to die in that 1 hour, if it's seriously dangerous, that's different. Okay. And so these obligations of not being callous, not being self-centered, she says, are no less grave than obligations of rights that are based upon something else. Okay, for her, more contractual agreements. In section 7, Thomson considers objections that say, as everyone always does, that her analogies are false because the relationship between the violinist and you in the violinist case, and the burglar and you in the burglar case, and Thomson and Henry Fonda are morally unlike the relationship between the fetus and its mother, that there's something some more intimate than those relationships. But here Thomson insists that we have no responsibility for another unless, quote, unless we have assumed it explicitly or implicitly. Parents must care for their children because they didn't abort them and they didn't put them up for adoption. They take them home implicitly, accepting responsibility for the child. But the same is not true in the case of just finding yourself pregnant, she thinks. But if they have taken, she says, all reasonable precautions against having a child, they do not simply by virtue of their biological relationship to the child who comes into existence have a special responsibility for it. Right? So merely being the bio mom of the fetus does not, she think, give the woman any sort of special responsibility for caring for it. In section 8, Thomson's last section, she gives us some examples of when she thinks it's clearly permissible and clearly impermissible to have an abortion. These are, as it were, easy cases for her. So a case of a 14-year-old girl who's been raped. So in the case, she says, a sick and desperately frightened 14-year-old schoolgirl pregnant due to rape may of course choose an abortion, and any law which rules this out is an insane law, she says. It would be indecent in a woman to request an abortion, and indecent in a doctor to perform it if she is in her 7th month and wants the abortion just to avoid the nuisance of postponing a trip abroad. Right? So these are easy cases for her. So that's pretty interesting, because when you think about when you think about a pregnancy in the 7th month, that means 2 more months of pregnancy. Actually, the 2 most uncomfortable months of pregnancy. And giving birth to a baby is no picnic in the park either. Okay. And yet it seems like Thomson thinks that it would still be indecent to have an abortion in those cases. So that's a lot longer than being attached to the violinist for an hour, maybe. More of a sacrifice. Also, I turn your attention to the last paragraph where she says, it should be remembered that we have only been pretending throughout that the fetus is a human being from the moment of conception. A very early abortion is surely not the killing of a person. So she is, doing some stuff that we might want not to do of conflating human and person. But she says a very early abortion is surely not the killing of a person, and so is not dealt with by anything I have said here. All right, so she seems to think that the standards of indecency, of what it would be indecent to do to a person or a human being, don't apply in cases of very early pregnancies, because she thinks it's not a person or a human being or whatever she is talking about there. Okay, it's not like you or me, she thinks, or even like a baby. Because of that, the standards for that must be met for an abortion to be indecent are much lower, because we're not talking, it's sort of like the standards perhaps of stepping on an ant or something like that. So I don't know that, I don't mean to put words in her mouth, but just so you get it, the standards of decency towards a human or a person are much higher than the standards of decency than those to a mosquito. Okay. And if a fetus is somewhere between, if a very early embryo is, or blastocyst or whatever is a conceptus or whatever it is very early on, is going to be somewhere between a mosquito and a baby in her mind. And so therefore the standards of decency of what it takes to treat that being decently are going to be correspondingly lower.